Good evening, friends. To all of you who have Zoomed in tonight, my name is Louis Jack Posner. I'm a past president of the Federation. This young lady behind me or next to me is my wife, not my daughter, and that's Rona Posner. She is also a past president of the Federation. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight's event features Dr. Stephen Windmeuller. It's sponsored by the Brandeis Baruch and Chaim Weitzman and Maimonides Societies of our Federation. These are our professional societies founded to support and strengthen Jewish life throughout our community. All the participants tonight are and will remain muted for the course of the program. However, if you want, you can use the chat box and Dr. Windmeuller will be accepting questions. I will moderate a Q&A at the end of the evening, and my bedtime is 10:30, so it will be somewhat restricted. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available later online. I'm particularly honored to welcome Dr. Windmeuller virtually back to Albany, where he was the executive director for 12 years and most of the 70s into the 80s of the precursor of our Jewish Federation, Greater Albany Jewish Federation. He is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of the Jewish Communal Studies at Jack H. Skirbel campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles, where I can tell you that they had a lot better weather than we did today. Prior to going to HUC, Dr. Windmeuller had served on the staff of the American Jewish Committee from 1969 to 72. He was with us here in Albany from 73 to 85, and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Federation from 85 to 1995. Candidly, Los Angeles weather doesn't compare with ours, but for some reason, Stephen preferred it. His tenure at the Hebrew Union College, he served for 10 years as the director of the School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, and in 2005 was named to the deanship of the LA campus, where he served from 2006 to 2010. And between 2012 and 14, he was invited to teach classes at USC and the Nanjing University in China. He's the author of 4 books and over 100 articles. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and the Jewish political behavior. His articles have appeared in a number of secular and Jewish publications. During the pandemic crisis, Dr. Windmeuller has devoted his research to examining the impact of the coronavirus on the American Jewish community and on the future of our community. He's currently working, editing a volume for USC, which he expects to be published this summer, examining the, quote, impact of Donald Trump's presidency on American Jews, close quote. We can't wait to see that one, Stephen. He serves as a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs, and he's a board member of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State, Los Angeles. For the past 6 years, he's been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, teaching around on the globe. I'm pleased to renew my friendship with Stephen and introduce him to you.
Thank you so very much, Louis Jack, and to you and Rona, and to all of the folks that are part of the Greater Northeastern Jewish Federation of New York. This is a particular honor, and I am so pleased that a number of the staff of the Federation have joined us, including its executive director, Rob Kovich. And I want to acknowledge Sarah Maestro for her assistance in helping to organize and to facilitate this program. Indeed, this is a homecoming in some measure, but it is also an opportunity for us to study together and explore the implications of COVID-19 on our communities. With that, I invite Sarah to bring up our slide presentation, and I look forward to your questions following this 20 to 25-minute introduction. In many ways, the coronavirus has been a unique moment in the American Jewish scene, certainly in the 21st century. But as we will explore this evening, it has certainly a number of core elements that have contributed to its evolution and its significance. Let's move to the next slide. Indeed, when one looks back on both facing and reliving a communal experience from 1973 to 1985, a number of the experiences at that moment in time certainly were penetrating to me and have profound importance, hopefully, to the community, its evolution, and its growth. And indeed, there were many great moments that we've experienced together during that period. To its leadership and to all that contributed to its evolution and development, from moving from a federated city model to a regional model, I am indeed most grateful for your loyalty, cooperation, and vision. And indeed, during that period, some of the very core themes that we will be talking about tonight were framed during that period. And indeed, what we learned about our partnerships with Israel, about the importance of technology, and about the significant transitions of generational leadership also have profound implications, even as we examine COVID-19 and its profound importance to American society and culture. The next slide, please. I think that some of the immediate takeaways for us and the general trends that we are all significantly aware of begins, unfortunately, with the notion of hate, anti-Semitism, and conspiracy. But this is not unique to this moment in time, because we know in the history of the Jewish people that during periods of plagues and difficult economic and social transitions, conspiracy and hate were a dominant theme, and unfortunately, anti-Semitism was a factor as well. But beyond that, we are looking at a moment in time where the rise of the virtual community has become a significant new element in our society. The technologies that have been advanced and supported during this period are particularly significant, and we will be exploring a particular aspect of that as we talk about the Jewish experience during COVID in that connection. Unfortunately, the economic story is not nearly as satisfying or as necessarily hopeful. There have been displacements, indeed mergers and closures, as we are aware, not only in the general society, but as we are beginning to document inside the Jewish community as well. We have raised an interesting question based on both Gallup and Pew studies. Is there a return to community? And is there some form of religious revitalization taking place? The data over the past year speaks to the fact that Americans of all different faith traditions have claimed that there is a growing and specific connection between this moment and their desire to deal with their own religious communities, strengthening their idea of faith in the construct of this moment. The next slide, please. Indeed, the particular sector that we are most concerned about this evening is certainly the nonprofit sector, and more generally, the independent sector, the agency that studies and explores the work and performance of nonprofits at all different segments and time periods, specifically reports that during COVID-19, we have seen a significant amount of retrenchment, a huge amount of experimentation, a significant amount of furloughing of employees, and certainly the reconfigurations of budgets and management of resources during this period. As this particular chart indicates, there are significant and challenging realities to the nonprofit sector in particular, and certainly for the Jewish communal system itself. This has been a challenging, if not at times difficult experience for our professionals, rabbis, educators, and teachers in particular, as they have experienced the impact of many of these transitions. The next slide, please. The Jewish Funders Network is sharing with us data over the last year and 2 months that are particularly significant. They are reporting that 76% of funders have increased their donations during this period, and 53% of funders have broadened their grant making, including 43% who have instituted emergency funding over this 12-month period. 77% of funders report changing their grant-making processes and practices to be more responsive, certainly more nimble during this crisis. And an extraordinary 94% of Jewish funders indicated that they intend to give at the same level or higher over the coming 12 months. And finally, that 72% of funders are encouraging at this particular time collaborations, joint ventures, and mergers among their grantee partners. The trends we are seeing with the Jewish funders system is also matched by the growing engagement of Jewish federations as partners, not only with foundations and funders, but with agencies and the community in managing the situation over this past year. The next slide, please. As we explore and relive the last 14 months, we remind ourselves that in some measure, what we have experienced this past year has been 1918 with the Spanish epidemic or pandemic of that time, the 1930s with the Great Recession and the Depression, the 1968 period of civil unrest in this country, as if all of that was in one moment encapsulated in 2020 and now again in 2021. This civil sort of uneasiness that we are exploring and experiencing is a particular and significant outcome of all of the factors that have taken place this past year, with the pandemic, in a sense, being the galvanizing force. We are likely, according to most demographers and sociologists, we are likely to see a generational pandemic, meaning young people who lived through the 2008 economic recession and are now living through this moment will develop certain lifestyle choices, behaviors, and practices that will define them as a kind of pandemic generation similar to the Depression generation of the 1930s. What the effects of that will be on their giving, on their engagement, relationship, affiliation, and the ways by which they secure their lifestyle choices will be a significant moment of study as we move forward. We're likewise seeing a very definite shift in our economy, and those shifts point to a higher degree of technology as being a key factor in driving the economic picture. The shift of small businesses having to make significant choices and decisions in the vacuum of this moment, and the reality that government plays and will play an increasingly important role in the next stages of the American economic story in light of the events of these past months. One of the core issues, which did not begin with the pandemic, but certainly has been accelerated by it, has been the element of trust. More Americans are less trustful of the vaccine, of government, of religious leaders, of political leaders, of cultural institutions than ever before. And this measure of trust is a profoundly concerning issue if we are to galvanize support to create a kind of consensus around community building, belief in moving forward, and in understanding and managing this pandemic. No doubt the American street itself has been a factor. 26 million Americans took to the streets last summer, whether it was for Black Lives Matter or in some combination of response to the issues before our society. It represented the single largest public expression that we have ever seen in the nation's history in terms of the street becoming an avenue for political expression. And indeed, as we've already noted, this pandemic has been hit with Asian hate, African American hatred, immigrant hatred, and certainly anti-Semitism. The next slide, please. More specifically, the findings we now have with regard to the Jewish community, based both on the Brandeis University studies of 17 communities, as well as the data collected by Ron Wolfson of the American Jewish University and by others, we can now, in a sense, frame the following outcomes. In many ways, the American Jewish experience as a result of this pandemic, the economic story, as well as the racial consequences of the events of the past year, are leading to a reimagining of the American Jewish experience in multiple ways. We see this in terms of how synagogues, schools, camps, federations, and other institutions are rethinking the ways by which they deliver messages, programs, and services. And we see it in the context that many Americans, Jewish or otherwise, are struggling with issues of loneliness, depression, and separation. And that will be an extraordinary story moving well beyond this moment. We have also learned that relational Judaism means something profoundly significant at this moment. Over these past months, those agencies, institutions, and synagogues that personalize relationships with their members and constituencies pointed to the fact that many of them benefited from these kinds of outreach services and connections, where connectivity was a powerful motif and model for creating and building stronger communities, even amidst this separation and these difficulties of being together. In a sense, we are, in some measure, redefining community. Will part of our community continue to be part of a Zoom culture? Will we see other parts of the community return to a kind of in-person community? What we are also seeing moving forward is the growing number of institutions that are seeking mergers, that are facing closures, and that are downsizing. We estimate that as of March of this year, some 25,000 Jewish communal professionals in the camping fields, in education, in the JCC worlds, and across the orbit of communal service have lost their jobs or are on furlough during the period of this pandemic. We are seeing the mergers of congregations of all different stripes, and we are seeing efforts at creating collaborative, integrative systems of cooperation models that we have not seen and could not identify prior to this COVID moment, but that have been triggered certainly by various events, well beyond COVID, but where this moment in time has accelerated those points of connection and collaborative cultural behavior. Indeed, we asked a number of questions in terms of whether or not we will be a virtual Judaism moving forward, or whether we will return to some kind of institutional models that we historically knew. It is the view of some of us that we will be a combination of these offerings, where some folks will be more comfortable and willing to return to institutional engagement, where others will seek to remain in a kind of virtual connective arrangement. We are looking at the beginnings of a 21st century sort of re-envisioning of the American Jewish community in many different ways. Possibly fewer institutions, the streamlining of services and cultural offerings, the nationalization of parts of the Jewish community, as we see certain kinds of institutions that have captured this moment and have developed sophisticated and long-term programming through the virtual methodologies available. And that is likely to continue as we see the reconstruction of a community which will have both national and local services in some measure competing with one another for time, financial support, and engagement. These structural changes are also met by the huge number of personal losses and changes. Indeed, the Jewish community, because of our age, has a significantly higher percentage of elderly Jews who have suffered from COVID and in some cases have succumbed. We are fully aware as well that the community, as with rest of American society, faces this huge emotional and psychological challenge of returning to community, and especially for our young people. The data suggests that young Americans in general, and more directly young students in particular, face numerous and significant challenges in being reabsorbed into the mainstream of the social network system. The next slide, please. In many ways, I think the outcomes here suggest, as we have noted, a changing role for government, increasing that role in certainly the near term, if not for a longer frame of time. Indeed, I think we have learned a great deal from both the 1918 pandemic and all of the events that followed in terms of other forms of coronavirus or other types of viral infections that have given us a broader and more sophisticated clue in terms of how we manage pandemics moving forward. And indeed, this event, coupled with the fact that we have lived through the Great Recession of 2008, will remind us that social structural trends are very much tied to over time experiences and not to single events. And that a lot of what we are seeing in American society are the ripple effects of these past number of years. And indeed, as noted just in the previous slide, the deep emotional, psychological, and physical well-being of Americans and of citizens of the world will be a particularly challenging issue for the healthcare industry as we move beyond this moment. What we are witnessing, however, is also the state versus the individual, a kind of hygienic fascism that is taking place, where people doubt the value of the vaccine, question the use of covering their face, or raise issues about the very existence of the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this creates this trust issue that we spoke about earlier, but is profoundly significant for society as it tries to manage in crisis those who disagree with the state's priorities and findings. And indeed, because the Jewish community is a significantly older constituency body than other white ethnic communities, we see the whole question of aging as a factor in the management for our community of dealing with this post-COVID moment and how we will be able to assist our seniors and elderly populations in moving forward. One of the interesting demographics that we are seeing in large cities, metropolitan New York, greater Los Angeles, and Chicago, as three particular examples, that there is a profound exit from large cities during this pandemic. This could be well have been anticipated and expected in the context that many folks with middle income or upper income capacities have decided to leave large cities during a pandemic, both to avoid the plague itself, but also as a way to live a kind of more suitable lifestyle, open lifestyle during this period. One of the core questions is whether these constituencies will be returning to large cities. And the demographic data would suggest that they may well not be returning. And that will be an interesting phenomenon in terms of the implications for the Jewish communities of large metropolitan areas as we see the exodus of folks from major communal settings. The next slide, please. I think in many ways, the story for us will be told in May when we receive the Pew Report of 2021. It will provide a core element to the Jewish community about major trends that are underway, both during and prior to the COVID crisis, but that will tell us a great deal about some of the core issues of the demography of American Jews moving forward. I think the data will tell us three things that we already believe to be in place: that we are seeing fewer marriages, that we are having fewer children, and that as a community, as we have already noted, we are considerably older than other constituencies that comprise the American middle class scenario. We have learned as well a great deal from the church world. And indeed, most mainline Protestants and evangelical communities are reporting that there will be the likely decline of the number of churches in the United States, anywhere from 1 out of every 5 church communities or congregations leaving the scene, to as many as having 1 in 3 leaving the scene. Those studies indicate that in the American church world, there was an absence of being prepared to deal with many of the features of the COVID situation, and that the Jewish communal system and its synagogue communities were in a better place in terms of the management of some of these issues in contrast to other religious cultures. As I have noted in my writings and also on this presentation, in many ways, the collaborative culture that we are seeing during this crisis is really a core outcome and beneficiary of what we have experienced. The ability of Jewish communal professionals, of rabbis, educators, and other leaders to find common ground, to seek ways to work collaboratively in managing issues is an important storyline in this particular moment. The other is the high burnout rate that we are seeing amongst Jewish professionals, rabbis, and educators. The extraordinary amount of pressure and implications for them in terms of their leadership and roles is profoundly important and also needs to be noted and attended to. And finally, I would say here as well that just as we are experiencing this virtual Judaism, we are also seeing in some communities a declining number of families and individuals holding affiliation and participation in traditional or legacy institutions. This is obviously of concern, as some families have felt the financial thrust of the moment, and others have used this opportunity in a sense to make a choice about continuing their affiliation and participation. With the availability of virtual opportunities abounding, many folks have turned to the opportunities available free of charge. And that has led to a decline in the presence of membership and affiliation in certain types of institutions. Indeed, all of this suggests, between the Pew study that will be released shortly, the data that we will gather and continue to gather from the events of this past 14 months, and the data that we are collecting over the course of the period from 2008 at the time of the economic recession through to this moment, will begin to shape for us what a 21st century Jewish community will be like. The continuing importance of federations, the changing role of funders and foundations, the increasing opportunities to experiment with technology, and the profound abilities to create new forms of engagement and participation. The next slide, please. I think, as this slide suggests, there are many issues pending before our communities. Indeed, amongst those questions will be the future of membership models and how that will work. In some communities, it will be about buildings and about real estate that the Jewish community has owned and operated and may no longer need or require as we go through some of these changes. And in other parts of our community, we will see the growing in a reality that we are or will need to create additional income streams to generate and support what is required in enhancing Jewish communal, religious, and cultural life. Indeed, what we have learned during this period is that strategic as well as crisis planning is an essential ingredient if we are to be prepared for any and all future conditions that require this kind of intervention and partnership. I think that the American Jewish community is indeed reflective of the larger society in many ways, in terms of the realities that we will see a re-engagement of how institutions will operate and which ones, in a sense, will leave the scene. The next slide, please. No doubt, I think in the end here, that what we are looking at is a generational reality, that younger people impacted by this moment and by the trend lines that we are seeing with millennials and Gen Zs in general will express through their behaviors coming out of this the kind of communal systems that they want and the kind of communal identities that they will have as we move forward. Indeed, I do believe that the old notion of bowling alone will give way to some form of new communalism. How that will be shaped and what that will look like is certainly too difficult at the moment to describe or to anticipate. But clearly, as we approach this moment, we understand that we have learned a great deal with regard to the experience of social media during this period and the effect of that, both positively and negatively, on the lives of our citizens. And indeed, what we are living through today is going to be complicated by additional challenges, whether it's climate change or other threats to the health and well-being of our larger society, that we will need to be anticipatory and prepared for in moving forward. The next slide. This is all about leadership in the end. It's about the folks that are on this call and across our communities in terms of being adaptive and responsive and flexible with visioning and the capacity, in a sense, to provide a kind of meaning and hope to people during a period in which there are often despair and where there are certainly both economic and structural challenges facing individuals, facing families, and facing communal institutions as well. But this is a moment for an experimental opportunity. It's the occasion by which, in a sense, as leaders, whether within the Jewish community or outside of it, have the unique opportunity to use this moment to strengthen our federations, to rebuild and nurture our schools, our camps, our synagogues, and our cultural and educational offerings. And this is an opportunity as well to rethink the relationship between foundations, our funders, and our community. So this is an extraordinary moment of change with a promise for a different and challenging outcome as we move beyond COVID-19. Thank you for your attention, and I do look forward to your questions and comments as we move forward.
Thank you, Steve. A very fascinating and challenging presentation about both the short-term and the long-term future, not only of Jewish communities everywhere, but in particular here in the Capital District. One of the things that comes to mind is that because COVID had such an impact on fundraising and the types of services that the Jewish community provided, where are we in the short term, do you think? Are we going to start from scratch like we were brand new, or will we be able to pick up more or less where we left off?
I think it may vary by situations or communities. There are communities certainly today that are anticipating all the challenges and the changes that are lying before us. And that, in a sense, is maybe the first task of strategic and crisis planning that is so critical in this kind of setting. The second piece here is that we will not know the full impact of both this experience on our institutions or on our populations until we come out of this. And I speak here both of the emotional and psychological issues that I addressed in the presentation, but also of the structural and financial challenges that our institutions may face once we have moved beyond this moment. So I think that this is a critical time for communal leadership to think about how we, in a sense, prepare for these transitions as we move out of this, and how in some cases this will be very gradual, and in other situations this may be certainly much more aggressive, depending on the comfort level of folks to move back into sort of the public square. So it's a bit unclear whether this is a transition back to something, or this is a transition into something rather new. I suspect it will evolve into something new as we move forward.
Thank you. Your presentation passed on the issue of anti-Semitism during the age of COVID. And can you opine about what the reason that there was a rise in both anti-Semitism, anti-Asian, all these antis, all these bad things as a result of COVID? What was the connection?
Well, I think there are several here that we're aware of. First of all, social media has been the conduit for most and much of this. And that, of course, has become a central piece to a lot that has been happening during the pandemic. And we have seen certainly some of the worst of the sort of hate language and optics through social media. Second, what we have noted in the history of humankind is that pandemics create, unfortunately, conspiratorial ideas, whether directed against one group or multiple groups. So that the second outcome here is this is a kind of natural, unfortunate linkage to the history of pandemics and the desire for people to somehow place blame, to create some rational or reasoned understanding of how could this happen, who is to blame, and why did this occur. The third factor is that we have been living through a period, a very difficult period in American politics in general over the course of the past number of years. And this moment simply adds to and builds upon that already divisive and destabilizing political culture. And so these three factors, social media, the history of conspiracies during pandemics, and the general political culture of a society are the three core elements that I believe drive this. We are also looking at a Jewish community that's in a very different place than we were 40 or 50 years ago. We need to understand that Jews are perceived as powerful, influential, and significant, even though our numbers suggest that we are a relatively small part of the American Jewish scene. But we are so visible politically, culturally, through all the venues and vehicles of American society, that our presence, in a sense, belies our numbers. And that has created a construct whereby Jews are seen as white. We are seen as not just white, we are seen as powerful whites. And it is no reason to dismiss the fact that in Charlottesville in 2017, the rally in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia and on the streets of Charlottesville was all about Jews will not replace us, which was this emblematic notion of the replacement theory found among some in the alt-right wing of the political establishment, who view, in a sense, that Jews are seeking to dominate, replace, and lead in an environment in which they are perceived as somehow not white, but seeking to become white. And likewise, on the far left, we have a similar circumstance of Jews being rejected because they are perceived as no longer part of a minority community that seeks to define itself along the lines of being either victims of history or having historical storylines that support other people's victimhood status. And rather, we are seen as pretenders seeking to become white and losing, therefore, our credentials and standings as a minority community, now becoming a white dominant community.
All right. Steve, your slides indicated, quite to my surprise, that people seem to have become more religious. But what does that mean in particular to the Jewish community and Jews going forward participating actively in religion?
Well, the data we have from Brandeis and other studies is fascinating. It suggests that last Passover, the high holidays, on Hanukkah, again this year for Passover, and at various other cultural, religious gatherings, the numbers of Jews participating in these moments of celebration and community engagement was extraordinarily high. In fact, that we reached higher levels of participation during this past year than we had seen in actual physical attendance or presence at such events the prior years. So part of this is that we were captured in our homes and in our particular localities, and therefore looking to find community and looking to create moments of connectivity with family, friends, or the larger society has actually led people to a kind of return to a participatory connection with these particular celebratory events. So our data suggests that these numbers have been extraordinarily impressive. We're getting thousands of people turning out on programs for speakers, for cultural events, whether from Israel or from various national and local institutions generated here in our communities. So it tells us that something here is happening. Now, whether that is sustainable beyond this moment will be the test, and whether or not it will translate into return to community and return to sort of religious engagement, that's an unknown for most sociologists at this point. But what we do see, though, is that we have had a particularly high expression of participatory engagement over this past year.
One of the questions that came through is the increasingly polarized American political establishment incapable of having Israel receive bipartisan support? Will the support of American aid to Israel become a zero-sum political game with only one party supporting the continued investments? And this is a very big concern for those of us who support Israel.
Absolutely. Well, it's an important issue. And Rob, I invite you to invite me back to deal with the diaspora-Israel relationship questions and the political fallout associated with that, because that's a whole separate conversation that I would be happy to have with our friends in the Northeastern New York Jewish community. But for a brief sort of standing on one foot response, my sense is that these kinds of questions are part of the larger shifts we're seeing in the American political culture. And when you read the book on Trump and the Jews, due out later this year, hopefully you will find some implications and information associated to why some of this is happening, and possibly ways in which we can move to offset some of these threats or challenges. No doubt, Louis Jack, the issue is there. The question is very much more complicated because it is happening actually on two fronts. We see it inside the Democratic Party between its progressive wing and its mainstream supporters. And yet we will also see something similar on the Republican side as we begin to look at what kind of republicanism will emerge in this battle over Trumpism and republicanism as that party itself goes through the changes. So the United States is going through this huge political transformation, where these questions will be certainly vital, but where we need to realize that there's a lot happening in both of our political camps.
Understood. That was a very good political science answer. I appreciate that. Anybody else have any questions? Please put them in the chat box. Here we go. Okay. Will synagogues have to entertain keeping their programs and services virtual for the future, or will we be able to transition back to in-person meetings, services, and congregational activities?
I think in the short term, what we are seeing in states such as New York and California will be some experimentation with small gatherings permitted in the separate or social distancing situations that will allow for congregations and communities to come together, but with these restrictions. This will alter as we move forward, assuming that more Americans receive their vaccinations, and that the data suggests that the pandemic itself is in some form of control or checked. My sense is that older Americans, and older American Jews in particular, will be somewhat slower to return to the public arena, as I suggested in the presentation. And therefore, we're likely to see a period in which congregations will be doing Zooming as well as in-person programming and services. And so this will be the challenge for congregational communities to continue, in a sense, to provide a sort of combination of these options until folks are more comfortable and until the medical authorities give us more of a full anticipation of when we can return to community engagement of the type and construct that historically has been part of our society. I think this is a particularly challenging question in terms of such celebratory moments as bar and bat mitzvah, confirmations, for high holidays. It raises for congregations huge challenges in terms of costs and balancing of resources in managing this in this short term. But in reality, I think that this will still take us anywhere from 6 months to a year before we're fully able to move beyond this point.
Hopefully, if herd immunity is achieved, then we'll be in a better position to know. But of course, as a community, we have to be ready when people are ready to come back to active and personal participation. You know, Steve, you know this community, and you know that our community in particular probably has a greater percentage of people 65 and older than your slide number indicated. And that has put pressure on the Federation and all the Jewish institutions in our greater community to provide services to the elderly. So a lot of folks home on their computers, and we see here we have in excess of 40 people who are online, and some of those are 2 or 3 people who are participating. Young people, and this is my personal experience, are picking and choosing. They go to Shabbat services in New York City or Boston where they're family members, or even where you are in Los Angeles. And once that starts to happen, and it's already a habit, how are we going to get those younger people back into our community and into our activities and additionally into just general communal life? That's another question. Yeah.
This is particularly challenging because, as I pointed out in the presentation, we're beginning to see sort of the nationalization of the Jewish community. That is, institutions, and I'll just name one, Central Synagogue in New York, or the Hartman Institute in Israel, being in a position to provide these kind of mega kinds of programming online, and that will ultimately also be available in person, to create a kind of national Jewish role or place that we have not really experienced before, because we had basically constructed a system where our congregational communities operated locally, retained and held loyalties and participation from its constituencies within its communities. But as we see this shift during the pandemic, this will be a challenge to the balance between this local and national equation. My colleague, Ron Wolfson at the American Jewish University, has just written this rather fascinating piece in which he describes what he sees as this sort of emergence of a kind of national Jewish synagogue culture, and how will we balance that with our interests and the preservation, if you wish, of local synagogue culture and continuity. So this is true, and especially affects millennials and Gen Zs. It's particularly attractive to folks who are interested in sort of the culture of being part of something that is new and creative and innovative, as many of these initiatives are. And so it will be challenging to sort of sustain or return people to sort of their localized or personalized and historic engagements. So that is something that we are all looking at with some interest and some actually concern.
I think the data that you've presented gives us, who are involved in planning or trying to plan the future, a springboard, but we don't know if there's water in the pool. It's going to be very challenging to reopen what we would call normal activity with limited funds. Your numbers showed that fundraising has been less successful. In our community, and in fact all over America, thanks to Harold Grinspoon, Life and Legacy program has really underscored at exactly the moment needed the reason why people who are doing estate planning and thinking about leaving wealth to the next generation have to give us the financial base to maintain a level of service, because we don't know what those young folks are going to do. And unfortunately, last year kind of knocked us all off balance. You want to weigh in on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are three factors here. What we have learned in this moment is the importance of endowments and foundations as partners. Second, we've learned the essential quality that if you care about community and are committed to community, you need to help endow and sustain the community even beyond your years and your own participation. And third, it is particularly critical in looking ahead that we understand the value added of strategic and crisis planning as a model for not only our communities, but for, in a sense, the nonprofit sector. Everything we have gained from this experience is that the challenges run very deep in terms of the kinds of health of our institutions. Synagogues that do not have multiple income streams are in particular trouble. Centers that have been forced to shut down multiple services and programs to reach larger audiences are certainly being challenged and are seeking ways, and in many ways have achieved those in creating some alternative program models. What this is all suggesting is that there's a lot of creative thinking that is in front of us in terms of what we walk away with from this experience and what we realize we do not have in place. And what we know we don't have in place are some of these core financial and structural elements. And what we cannot necessarily predict in looking forward is who will be following us, who will be sustaining and maintaining the institutions as we explore the fact that younger generations have different sort of social and religious norms about what is important to them and how religious life and cultural life plays out for them. So there's a magnificent sort of storyline here about this transition of generations and that effect or impact on the future of the American Jewish communal model.
A question was posed, Stephen, about whether the numbers, the statistics, and the data you have available indicate whether the Jewish community as a whole is doing better, worse, or the same as other religious communities coming out of this pandemic.
We're clearly doing better than some. I point to you with some sorrow and concern that we see already some of the downsizing that I referenced with Protestant church communities within the Roman Catholic community. In many major dioceses of the United States and large cities, Boston, New York, Los Angeles for sure, the church has already announced the closures of a number of its schools and a number of its different chapels and sanctuaries. Of course, that is a centralized system and works certainly very differently than our communal and the synagogue model. But it is an important one to look at because it points to the fact that we will have to learn that a collaborative culture and an adjustable economy require us to, in a sense, think about ways in which we facilitate doing things together. And that is a change model from the sort of independent modality that we went into this moment with. Historically, we saw our institutions as alternatives, as competitive, as options to other choices. What we have to now create is the fact that this is a community that has multiple offerings, but collaborates around helping people find their voice and their home and their way into these communal choices. And that will be a particularly challenging feature because culturally we simply haven't always been there. And that is a fundamental shift. The realities is that I know that both United Synagogue and the Union for Reform Judaism are particularly concerned about is how to keep synagogues viable, and where they may not be viable, how to make sure that they have partners that can enhance and ensure that members have opportunities to continue to be afforded the resources, the services, and the cultural options that they would want.
Good. Steve, the final question I'd like to pose to you is, what do you see as the future of the Jewish community's relationship with Black Lives Matter movement going forward? That has been such a controversial issue, and we're struggling with it on a daily basis.
Thank you, Rob. Another topic that happy to come back and
yay
an hour with your community. You have an extraordinary JCRC, and Shelley Shapiro is a profoundly impressive professional. So I'm not sure that I can add in one moment a great deal, but what I would offer is the following. Black Lives Matter is not a national organization. It's a series of localized groups, bottom up in its organizing. So the different behaviors and different goals or outcomes that are being portrayed depends on your community, depends on the particular players. And that's a model very different from other systems that certainly the Jewish community has dealt with, both with the African American community and with other groups. So we need to understand that the operational model of Black Lives Matter is bottom up, and that is a very important finding and reality. The second factor is, as the Jewish community needs to always deal with what its self-interests are. Now, its self-interests include, of course, racial justice and certainly concern for every citizen having the appropriate access to his or her rights, going through our system as a voter, as a citizen, as a participant in the society. The critical piece here is that we don't get thrown in a sense, by the language and the discourse on the public or national scale. What's happening in every community has important implications for the community. It's policing, it's courts, it's housing, it's economic access, and all the other resources that go into building a vital and viable community. So it is important that the Jewish community be cautiously prepared to pick and choose the issues that it can and will engage with, and remind itself that there are other institutions in addition to Black Lives Matter that care about these issues as well, including the Black Church, including the Urban League, including the National Association of
the ACP.
Yes, and other institutions that in fact represent or reflect different parts of the African American community. So it's critical that we not run from this issue, but it's also critical that we are selective in how we participate.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Stephen has graciously allowed me to give you his email address. So if you want to send him regards as an old friend, or just keep in touch with him, I'm going to go slowly. It's capital S, capital W, INDMUELLE. It's his name without the R on the end at huc.edu. And if anybody didn't get it and wants it, Rob or I can provide it. Steve, I want to thank you. Very, very important issues that you touched upon. Your research obviously is in depth. We're looking forward to the book that's coming out this summer. I hope you make as much as you can from it. We talked to Steve briefly before the program. He was asked if he was retired, and he said, depends what you mean. He's still writing, he's still researching, he's still lecturing. And Steve, we just hope you continue to do that. Just been great. For everybody, thank you for attending tonight's program. Please join us. We have some other great programs. An Emmy-nominated comedy writer, Bess Kalb, will be with us next Tuesday, April 27th at 8 p.m. Our next society event will have the leading expert on Iran's nuclear program and its global threat, Mark Dubowitz, on May the 2nd. Details are on the Federation's website. It was great to see so many old friends and some other people we obviously haven't been together for over a year. But I thank you all for coming. Drive home safely, so to speak. Thank you for coming. Take care of yourselves and each other.